It is tough to describe this one. Hello everyone, I'm GoldenSound, you're watching the Headphone Show by Headphones.com, and this is the Abyss Joal, or Joel, one of the two. Joel, let's stick with that. This is the latest headphone from American manufacturer Abyss, and it was sent in for review by Level Audio. Thank you very much for lending me these for a little bit to try out. And whilst it doesn't technically carry the Diana series name, it does use the same overall style and design language of the chassis and the pads as previous Diana models did. It's fair to say that the overall design and construction of Abyss headphones has been controversial. Not in terms of quality, mind you. In fact, they literally ran over their flagship 1266 with a car, and it was fine. The overall build quality on the Joel is also excellent. The chassis itself is all CNC'd metal, with a finish that looks pretty great in my opinion, and also means it's not going to easily pick up fingerprints and smudges. The headband has a nice leather-wrapped metal band for the main part, and then a felt strap underneath, which I wouldn't technically call a suspension strap, given as it does still touch the top, including when on the head. But despite the fairly minimal padding, I did find it quite comfortable for long periods of use, and didn't seem to get problems with hotspots. I do have a bigger head than most though, so that may vary for you depending on whether on your head more of the weight is being supported by the ear pads pressing against the side of your head or the actual top headband itself. For me, most of it's on the ear pads, so I don't really mind the lack of padding on the top so much. The pads themselves attach with a magnetic system that makes it extremely easy to remove or change them, and you'll notice that they're a bit of an odd shape. That's because they're designed to better fit the contours of your head and fill in the gap behind your jaw a little bit. And that's also kind of necessary because on the headphone itself, there is no swivel at all whatsoever. The only adjustment available is extending the cups down from the headband via what is a very nice system, using permanent magnets instead of any mechanical parts, thereby meaning it should in theory never wear out. And you can also rotate the pads, but I imagine that on most people's heads, it's going to warrant them staying with the widest part at the bottom rear, or the default. This lack of any swivel at all on the cups does mean that if these don't fit your head naturally, you're out of luck. There's nothing that you can really do. And for me personally, because these don't swivel vertically either, and I've got quite a big head, the top of the pad presses in quite a bit. Not uncomfortably at all, actually. In fact, if anything, it's kind of a benefit because it means I definitely don't get any hotspots on the top, but it leaves a little bit of a gap down the bottom here. So I don't get a full seal with these headphones when just putting them on my head, and I actually had to do a lot of my evaluative listening whilst gently pressing the headphones in against my head to force a full seal. That can be quite important because if you don't have a complete seal, it changes the bass response quite substantially. Now, some people might actually quite like what happens when you don't have a full seal on these. What happens is you get a bit of a punchier, meatier sort of sound because it provides quite a bit of an elevation in the mid-bass around the sort of 80 to 100 hertz region or so. But you lose quite a bit of your sub-bass, the deeper stuff towards 20 hertz. So it's a little bit punchier, harder hitting, but then for really low frequency synths and thunderous rumble aspects, it's just not quite there. If I press them in against my head to force a full seal, the bass response flattens out quite a lot. It sounds tighter, more controlled, although a little bit less punchy because the mid-bass isn't quite as prominent. So that's something which, depending on your preference, could go either way. Now, I actually own a pair of Abyss 1266, and I love them. For electronic music in particular, I reach for those headphones more than anything else because they are just crazy good fun. And they use this effect, in fact they're designed to run with a very slight gap. You can tune this to your liking by playing with the fit, the angle of the cups, and how much they press in against your head, so you can run anything from a full seal to a massive gap or anything in between and tune that bass presence to your liking. So you can get a sort of tighter but less punchy effect or a hard-hitting visceral mid-bass, even though you've got a little bit less sub-bass. But the point is, you can kind of dial it in, whereas on these, for the most part, what you get is what you get, and it's going to vary a lot depending on the shape and size of your head. The Joel are not an uncomfortable headphone. They are quite comfortable on my head, it's just that the ergonomics are pretty inflexible, and I really do wish that there was more adjustment available, because otherwise the experience with these is going to vary a huge amount from person to person. So how do the Joel sound? Well, let's take a look at the frequency response. And it's important to note that this is not actually our measurement. Our BNK5128 measurement system is over with Resolve in Canada. So I'm going to be using a measurement from Abyss themselves, also taken on a 5128 here instead. But we've applied our standard methodology, which is to compensate the result to the DFH-RTF of the 5128 and plot it against the preference bounds. For those who don't know what those words mean, effectively, the headphone is measured on a head and torso simulator, and then the effect aspects of the ear and head of the measurement system itself are subtracted, so we're just looking at the differences between how this headphone behaves and what that rig would actually hear as neutral. If you want to learn more about HRTF and our measurement approach as well, there's a really good article written by Griffin, aka Listener, linked in the description below. So, first thing to mention, it looks like this measurement was taken with a full seal, since the bass is relatively flat down towards 20 Hz. If there was a broken seal, then what we'd expect to see is a fairly significant mid-bass peak, which we're not seeing here, so that does strongly imply that this headphone was seated and sealed properly against the rig. There are various places where it does fall outside the preference bounds, and to be frank, it looks a little spooky at first, but it sounds a lot better than it looks on the graph at first glance. So let's start with the bass. Now, as mentioned, this will quite significantly depend on how this headphone seals and fits against your head. If you get a full seal, you'll get something much more similar to what is shown on the graph at the moment. If you get a broken seal, then you'll get more mid-bass and less sub-bass. But it does look like it's a somewhat bass-light headphone, and that's how I hear it too. It rolls off a little bit, a few dB below 50 Hz or so, nowhere near as much as something like a Sennheiser HD650, about the same as a Headphone D1. You just don't quite get the same linear bass extension into the sub-bass as on something like a HiFiMan HE1000 Unveiled. For this reason alone, the Joal is not quite as fun and engaging for me as either Abyss's own 1266 or various other similarly or cheaper priced options. Bass is not really its strong suit. I wouldn't necessarily call it a particularly bass-light headphone like the HD650, but it's also just not particularly strong in that area. And the addition of a bit of a bump in the 200 to 400 Hz region, as you can see on the graph, does give it a bit of extra low-end warmth, but I also find in certain circumstances can make things sound a little bit imbalanced. Tracks like Blind by Bronson can be pretty skull-shakingly thunderous and engaging on many headphones, even those that aren't necessarily bass-heavy, but just linear bass extension. The HE1000 Unveiled or the Aria Stealth, actually, as a cheaper option, are excellent with this track. Extremely engaging, forceful, heavy, and rumbly, but on the Joal, it's just not. It's just lacking a little bit, and that's a little bit of a shame. The track Bam Bam by Closey, this one I quite like to use for testing the more fast, hard-hitting elements of bass. And on headphones, again, with a more linear bass extension, like the HiFiMan Aria Stealth, it is hard-hitting and pretty visceral for the percussive elements, and then deep-reaching and rumbly for the low-frequency synths. Whereas on the Joal, it's just not as much. It's not like it's not enjoyable, it's still there, it's just not as much as the other headphones, and does leave me wanting a little bit more. This has a more pillowy profile to its overall bass. The mid-range is a pretty unique profile on this headphone. I can't think of many other headphones that are particularly similar in this area, and you can see that there are some interesting deviations. This is also where I'm going to deviate from the technically correct assumption a little bit. The vocals on this, male vocals in particular, sound a little bit more contrasty than on a lot of other headphones. The 200 to 400 Hz region is fairly elevated, which gives them a little bit more low-end body and warmth, which a lot of people are going to like, and thanks to the slightly elevated treble above 6 kHz or so, they don't at all lean towards being muddy or lacking clarity. In fact, in terms of clarity and detail retrieval, these really are very good. It's quite an interesting and unique presentation for vocals, and one that I found myself really quite liking. If you want realism and transparency, this isn't it. Swapping over to the Headphone D1, everything immediately sounds more correct. But the Joal has a slightly ZMF-y vibe to it, just with more detail and clarity, which I think is going to appeal to quite a lot of people. It certainly appeals to me. Having vocals be a little bit fuller than is accurate can in many cases be very enjoyable, especially if you're not sacrificing on the treble and lacking clarity in doing so. As we look towards the upper mid-range and the treble, you can see that there is a little bit of a dip at 2 kHz, but nowhere near as substantial or wide, more importantly, as many other headphones like a Sennheiser HD800S or HiFiMan Susvara OG, in fact many HiFiMan models to be honest. The Joal takes a little bit more of a measured approach with its 2 kHz dip here, and to my ear, this does two things. Firstly, these don't stage as big as those headphones. The 2 kHz dip is often in the community referred to as the soundstage dip because it does seem to have the effect of making things sound more spacious and expansive. So for those that love soundstage, headphones with more of a substantial 2 kHz dip are often going to be the way to go. But it has the drawback that it does affect vocal timbre, to me often making things sound a little bit more nasally. The track Peter Pan Was Right by Anson Seabra is one that I use quite a lot to test this because his voice just seems to make this effect pretty obvious. Listening to that song back to back on a Rala Manis and then a Susvara Unveiled is a stark contrast. On the Joal, the timbre of the vocals in this track is actually better and closer to sounding correct to my ear than it is on the Sennheiser HD100S. It's just warmer and more intimate sounding, which, depending on your preferences, one of those two directions could be the better way to go. So it's not necessarily a right versus wrong, it's just a bit of a different thing. These are definitely on the warmer side, likely due to that 200 to 400 Hz lift again, but in terms of timbre and vocal accuracy, I did personally find that the 2 kHz dip on the HD100S and on some Headphone headphones as well was more subjectively detrimental to the timbre of the vocals than that 200 to 400 Hz lift was. So overall, these ended up winning out for the most part there, which was kind of interesting to me because just looking at the graph, I would have assumed the opposite. What the Joal is lacking here is a little bit of presence. There's plenty of clarity and incisiveness to things like consonants, and that translates over to drums and cymbals as well, because the upper treble is reasonably prominent. But for vocals, it often feels like they're a little bit pushed back in the mix because there's a bit of a hole around 4 kHz or 4.5 kHz. On my head, it sits closer to 4. On the measurement here, you can see it's about 4.5. This has the effect of making it feel like vocals are kind of fighting with other elements in the mix a bit, and I almost wanted to turn the volume up more than I usually would to make the vocals sound like they were correct in level, but then the other stuff gets too loud and so I've got to turn it back down again. This was relatively easy to fix with EQ, just throw a 3 dB or so filter with about a Q of 3 at 4.5 kHz, although again, just check where it sits on your head. At my head it's about 4 kHz, and immediately everything sounded much better. But out of the box, it just feels like vocals are a little bit pushed back in the mix, a little bit kind of woolly. Even though there is no problem with clarity to them, they just feel a little bit almost quieter than they should. When it comes to detail retrieval and clarity, these are pretty excellent, to be honest. The overall upper treble is somewhat elevated, but I never found that bothersome for 2 reasons. Firstly, I think that it's just inherently somewhat balanced out a bit by the excess lower mid-range warmth. It's a little bit more of a kind of U or V shape to it, but that lower mid-range excess does help to balance out the treble and doesn't leave you feeling like it's a bright headphone. This does not sound like a bright headphone to me. It's also just less bright, demonstrably speaking, than something like a Headphone HE1000 Unveiled, and in direct comparison to that headphone, I found it much more pleasant to listen to these for longer periods of time than the HE1000 Unveiled, because the HE1000 Unveiled is overall quite a bit brighter. The overall treble profile on this honestly works really well for me as long as that 4 kHz dip is filled in. That does negatively affect the sound of vocals and other instruments for me to quite a notable degree, but again, it was relatively easy to fix. If you get these, I would highly recommend trying to use some EQ, both just to add a little bit of a bass shelf to fill in some of that roll-off and to fix that 4 kHz bit. Once you fill in that 4 kHz dip, these are not a reference neutral headphone, they're not really trying to be. You do get a more contrasty profile to the vocals, and you get a little bit more of lower mid-range warmth as well, but that's why I've been enjoying them. These again sound quite a lot like sort of ZMF style house sound, but with more clarity and detail, and I've really been enjoying that. But I do have to stress, that is with the 4 kHz area filled in. If you don't do that with EQ, you just listen to these out of the box stock sound, then I'm a lot less positive on these. That 4 kHz notch does really quite drastically affect the sound of vocals, and I much prefer it with a little bit of EQ just to fill that in. So I'm left in a bit of an uncertain position on these. Build-wise, the quality is simply excellent. Abyss is one of the best when it comes to the material build quality of their headphones. And whilst I understand the logic behind some of the design decisions, eliminating moving parts so that they should last longer and hopefully last a lifetime, I do feel that some of these decisions were the wrong ones, and that moving parts are necessary if it means that the headphone is actually going to be able to fit different people's heads properly. The build quality of the Joal is excellent, but the ergonomics are mixed, and if you want to figure out if they're going to actually fit properly on your head, you kind of just have to try them out. If you're wanting to buy some headphones and not need to worry about whether you like it or whether it's going to fit your massive noggin, then consider headphones.com for your next audio purchase, since they have a 365-day return policy, so if you buy something and it doesn't fit, you can just send it back up to a full year later. In terms of sound, I can say that this is my favorite of the Diana line headphones, even though it's not technically a Diana headphone. This gets the closest to technically correct and is doing a lot of things really well. It offers a nice additional low mid-range warmth, which makes a lot of vocals sound pretty pleasant, with some extra elevated upper treble to balance things out and make sure that it doesn't at all sound muddy or lacking clarity. I do also like the balance between stage and timbre that it has in the 2 kHz region. A lot of headphones either go too far with their 2 kHz dip, which makes things sound very spacious and expansive, but makes vocals sound a little bit nasally, or they go too far the other way, like an HT650 for me, and just leave it sounding completely closed in and in your head, even though the vocals might be very good. This is a really nice balance. It's not a super expansive headphone, but still gives you some sense of space. Meanwhile, vocals don't sound nasally and thin. It's doing that part quite well. But that 4 kHz dip is a problem for me. I found it easy enough to EQ, and if you're willing to use EQ with your headphones, then it's not so much of a problem, but it's just a shame that out of the box, it does leave vocals feeling a little bit too far back and fighting for space in the mix amongst the other elements. They just weren't really present enough. And then for the bass, I'm kind of neutral. This isn't a particularly bass-light headphone. Again, it rolls off about the same as the Headphone D1, but I would want to add a little bit of a bass shelf on both the Headphone D1 and on these as well. It sounds quite a lot better when you just fill that in a little bit. So, a little bit neutral. I wish I had a little bit more, but it's not necessarily enough of a roll-off to complain about either. So overall, I enjoyed this headphone more than I expected. It's my favorite of the Diana line, if you count it in that, but it's also significantly more expensive than other headphones that I would personally say are overall better, such as the Headphone D1 or the Hyperman Aria Stealth, unless the colorations in the mids that this has are exactly to your liking. And I definitely have to suggest trying it before you buy, simply because the ergonomics are going to be a challenge for some. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you've got any questions you wanted to ask about this headphone, any other headphone, music, DACs, amps, gear, streaming services, or anything else, come and say hey on the Headphones.com Discord server or the Headphones.com forum, and I and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. Until next time, I'm GoldenSound, you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com. Thanks for watching.